She read 3 words, and the room rewrote itself. The smallest sound in the cathedral, the tremor of a phone screen unlocking, felt enormous to Beatriz. For a moment she only saw the message, white against black. "Sorry, I can't." Her fingers tightened around the bouquet until the stems cut into her palm. Pollen dusted her knuckles like a shame she could not wipe away. Around her, the choir kept singing, because the choir always sang. The organ swelled, and the priest's mouth moved the words he had practiced 100 times. But the air inside the church had changed. Guests shifted in their seats, eyes sliding from the aisle to the woman in the ivory gown, who could no longer pretend the script was intact. Her bridesmaids tried to smile, but the smiles sat like masks. A cousin whispered something that might have been an apology. Someone's fork clattered in the terrace beyond the stained glass. A camera flash punched white through the dim like a sudden thought of betrayal. She tried to fold herself small, to press her heels into the carpet and become a private thing. Her father's hand on her elbow felt leaden, as if he too could not bear the weight of what everyone was seeing. Beatriz's throat ached, not from the secrets of her body, but from trying to keep a composure that had been rehearsed for months. Her world, the months of planning, the meticulous guest list, the favors, the seating chart, had been reduced to 3 brittle syllables glowing on a screen. Someone laughed. It was a sound she could not place between malice and disbelief, and it cut deeper than the message. Behind the laughter, phones bloomed like small constellations, cameras balancing on knees, feeds already splitting into fragments destined for other people's evenings. The wedding that had been designed to be private and intimate was suddenly a spectacle. Beatriz tried to picture Raphael's face, the explanations he might make, the texts he might send pleading for forgiveness, but the image would not hold. The number belonged to the man who had promised that he would stand at the altar with her, who had traced maps of their future across the backs of napkins, and who had convinced her that the careful life she wanted could be ordinary and safe. Instead, his name blinked at the top of the screen, and the message remained, "Sorry, I can't." A voice, low and measured, came from the back of the nave. It did not carry the warmth of a gallant hero or the flutter of spontaneous romance. It carried something steadier, like the click of precision gears engaging. Beatriz could not make out the man's features at first, only the line of his shoulders, the pattern of his suit, the distance in his stance. He had been a peripheral figure in her life. Rodrigo Tavares, her boss, known for a reputation that equaled his bank statements, efficient, remote, and always impeccably controlled. "Beatriz," he said, moving as if each step was calculated so that no one would see him rush.
He knelt beside her with a grace that made her small tremor in the aisle feel like a private earthquake. The church seemed to tilt toward them. Flashbulbs popped in a rhythm like distant artillery. Rodrigo leaned close enough that she could feel the cool scent of his cologne, bergamot, an austerity translated into scent, and when he spoke, it was almost a whisper. "Pretend I'm the groom." It was not dramatic. There was no sweeping declaration, no grandstanding. It was an offer and a command at once, uttered with the authority of a man used to getting what he required by being decisive. The words landed in her ear and folded into the space where panic and shame had taken root. The priest was still smiling, suspended between the script of vows and the sudden rupture of content. Guests looked on like an audience expecting a performance to continue. For the first second, Beatriz stared at Rodrigo as if he had conjured the words out of thin air. Then she noticed the way his eyes met hers, not with curiosity, not with pity, but with a calculation that included the tiniest hint of something like worry. His jaw was a plane softened only by the tension of someone who had decided to break his own solitude to do something unpredictable. "Why would you—" Her voice was small and foreign to her. "Because no one should stand here like a punchline," Rodrigo said. His tone was frank, the kind of honesty that did not ask for validation. "You don't want this to become the story, Bea. Let me stop it." Even as she heard the words, Beatriz recognized the danger in them. Letting him step in would mean accepting help from a man who held enormous power over her career. It would mean being indebted in ways she couldn't yet name. And yet, to decline was to feed the rumor mill, to let social media harvest her humiliation when it was freshest. Her father tightened his hand on hers and squeezed, asking a question with his look. Behind him, Julia, her oldest friend, had tears she hadn't tried to hide. Guests shifted like an approaching tide. "You will have to be decisive," Rodrigo murmured. "Now, this is not the time for an argument, Beatriz." It was the speed in his voice that did it. Events had already started to align themselves, phones tilted toward them, the priest's eyebrows rose in a question, and a cousin murmured into someone else's ear as if to begin the transformation from scandal into spectacle. There would be photographers at the reception, there would be comments within minutes. Beatriz could feel the weight of the possibility of her life being dissected. She nodded before she had convinced herself fully. Consent in that moment was not romantic, it was a lifeline. She rose because she wanted to stop being the center of a joke. She walked down the aisle, the kiss of polished wood under her heels, the breath of the congregation, 1,000 small admonitions. Rodrigo took the other side of the aisle with a steadiness that made him seem older than he was, as if the role he stepped into had been written on him in invisible ink for years. The priest stammered for a way to reconcile the sudden change. Some guests whispered scandal, and others whispered compassion. Rodrigo addressed the priest in short phrases that translated the event into something less fragile. He told a story about an old family friend, an emergency, about how sometimes things had to be improvised when real life trespassed on ceremony. He did not try to lie. He invented plausibility with the ease of a man accustomed to shaping narratives to his advantage. When he took Beatriz's hand, it was public sanction disguised as tenderness. The cathedral lights caught the ring she had hoped to put on his finger that day. She squeezed the bouquet until the stems bruised. The photographer, alive to the drama, leaned forward, and the camera shutter recorded the moment in a series of stolen breaths. The kiss at the altar was not a fusion of hearts, it was a closure, a lip press that rewired the cameras so that in the photographs it would look like the story had always been scripted this way. Applause was a polite applause, but the applause was there. People resumed protocols of celebration because humans prefer the illusion of resolution to the discomfort of hanging ambiguity. At the reception, Rodrigo moved like someone who had trained for this form of rescue. He stood when appropriate, took toasts with a measured smile, and filled the gaps with precise phrases about love and the unexpected turns life takes. Beatriz floated through the later hours in an uncanny numbness, served champagne she did not taste, smiled for photos she could not remember taking. She felt the press of a veil that came to her neck as if to muffle any further sound of the world collapsing. There were dances. There were guests who clapped because clapping was the social machine's method of smoothing over jagged things. Phones kept buzzing in people's pockets and purses, and the reception was more a staging ground for images than a real party. Videos uploaded while they ate, frames cut into short sensational lines. Headlines the next day would be merciless in their efficiency. Bride left at altar. Cold-hearted tycoon saves the day. Someone would add an arrow to the online summary, an implication that there was always something transactional beneath the rescue. She woke the next morning with the photographs pressed like evidence into her skull. The images were everywhere. Rodrigo's hand holding hers at the altar, a grin that read like reassurance on his face. The priest with a diplomatic smile that belonged more to an actor than to a man of the cloth. Her phone, once again, became an instrument of other people's narratives, messages, new friend requests, a flood of direct messages that ranged from sympathy to conquest. An influencer made a short clip of the ceremony with snarky commentary and a laugh that ricocheted like salt against a wound. Rodrigo arrived at the office at 9, composed, as if sleep had been a courtesy he had been allowed. The firm was alive with whispers and glances. For a week, no meeting started without someone cautiously looking at the calendar, as if trying to map out where the story might tumble next. Beatrice's desk felt exposed, a cubicle like a glass cage. Her mail had been collected into a thick envelope by sympathetic colleagues. She sat at the edge of her chair, something practical and domestic anchoring her planner, scribbled lists, a sweater that still smelled faintly of smoke from the reception's candles. Rodrigo's office door was closed when she was summoned. He gestured her in with the same precise motion he'd used in the church that day. There was a cup of coffee on his desk, untouched, and the skyline outside his windows cut the city into cold blocks of light. "We need to discuss the fallout," he said. There was no preface. He sat across from her with a formality that felt like a shield. She read it as control and as concern all at once. "What do you mean, we?" Beatrice asked, wary and exhausted. "You could have walked away." "I could have," he replied, folding one hand over the other. "But you didn't deserve to be the spectacle. The cameras would have drawn lines around you, and that would have followed you for years. Reputation at that level becomes shorthand for character. I don't think that's fair." His hands were big, calloused at the edges, and from where she sat they seemed like rhetorical anchors. He was calm in a way that made her own pulse feel loud and unsteady. "We need to be pragmatic. The ceremony was witnessed and recorded. There is a signed certificate. Legally, you and I are recognized as married until proven otherwise." She felt all her muscles compress. "You mean—" He did not need to finish. She imagined a stack of forms, a seal of a state, the bureaucratic machinery aligning itself into something that would demand either an annulment or a divorce. An annulment, he explained in the clinical tenor of someone who had consulted lawyers before, would require an investigation into the validity of the marriage at the time it occurred, proof of incapacity, coercion, or fraud. That path could expose private details to public scrutiny. A consensual divorce would be quicker, cleaner, and would avoid the judicial limelight. It would also, of course, include the diplomatic choreography of appearances. "Do you want this?" he asked suddenly, his gaze steady on her face. It was the first time he asked her about her desire in direct terms. The question had multiple answers. She wanted privacy. She wanted dignity. She wanted the rumor mill to stop slicing pieces of her life into clickbait. She did not want her future employment prospects to be attached to a viral scandal.
She did not want to be indebted to a man who could, with one signature, make her life easier and yet also more complicated. "Yes," she said finally. The word tasted like resignation and relief braided together. They met with lawyers that afternoon. Beatrice watched as the legal advisor, a narrow man with a sympathetic voice, sketched the road ahead in thick, pragmatic strokes. A temporary separation of personal and professional interactions, an agreement to pursue a consensual divorce after 6 months, unless either party wished otherwise, confidentiality clauses to control leaks, and a rudimentary protocol for public appearances that would frame them as mutual friends handling an unfortunate incident. 6 months, the lawyer said. It's a reasonable cooling-off period. During that time, you can decide whether to pursue an annulment, if you have grounds, or file for divorce. Consensual divorce is usually faster if both parties agree and cooperate. "Why 6 months?" Beatrice asked. "Why not immediately?" "Time makes things cleaner," the lawyer replied. "It gives both sides room to collect documentation, to consider counsel, and to avoid impulsive decisions that might later prove more damaging. And it helps with the optics. If you rush, the narrative implies that the marriage was premeditated, which opens a series of reputational and possibly legal complications." Rodrigo did not try to downplay his role in the state of affairs. "You will have my support," he said, "but I won't ask you to do anything that compromises your autonomy or your career. We will establish boundaries." That was the word that anchored the rest of the conversation: boundaries. Rodrigo wanted to avoid any suggestion that the rescue had been a manipulative ploy. Beatriz demanded, quietly but firmly, that the arrangement not be used to blur lines at work. She insisted on explicit measures. She would not accept preferential treatment. Projects would be reassigned if there was a perceived conflict of interest. Any public statement would be coordinated and neutral. The following days at the company felt like the aftershocks of an earthquake. Some servers whispered pity, others whispered opportunity. The rumor that Rodrigo had performed a private act of heroism for an employee spread into the market as a rumor of leverage. Investors called. A financial magazine wanted a cover story on him that would try to turn the rescue into a soft-focus parable about big-hearted billionaires. Rodrigo declined the interview. He refused celebrity spin. His silence created its own narrative. People read it as magnanimity or as calculative restraint, contingent on their appetite for cynicism. Beatriz, meanwhile, returned to a life that had to be navigated under glass. Coffee machines hummed with gossip. Her email had more messages than before, ranging from supportive to invasive.
The company's HR department arranged a meeting to review guidelines and to ensure that no lines would be crossed. Rodrigo sat through those conversations with a neutrality that was almost formal. He agreed to delegate any direct oversight that could create an appearance of impropriety. He instructed his executive assistant to make this a matter of procedure rather than of favor. Between the public maneuvers and the legal strategies, there were tiny human actions that began to map a different kind of relationship. Rodrigo sent over a bag of migraine pills when Beatriz called in sick after the reception with a fever. He handed her an umbrella on a day when rain blitzed the city into a gray wash. At the end of a long Friday, he walked with her to the company garage and asked if she wanted a ride because subway stairs would jar an ankle she'd been nursing. These were small things that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with practical kindness. She resisted reading them as anything but sympathetic. Rodrigo had his own measured reserve. His gestures were accurate without being theatrical. There were no flashes of sentimentality, no declarations that tried to fill the silence. Yet, in a world where people preferred to interpret every courtesy as obligation, even those small actions took on exaggerated meanings. Co-workers watched as if awaiting the reveal of a tube of paint that would change the portrait of both of them. The online press, meanwhile, had not let go. A gossip site published a piece on the legal options available to couples thrust into surprise marriages, complete with quotes from a legal analyst who spoke in hypotheticals and theorems. Someone invented a rumor that the marriage would be leveraged for business advantage. An unnamed source claimed Rodrigo saw PR value. Rodrigo's team performed a quiet damage control campaign, denials, clarifications, a single neutral statement that recognized the unusual circumstances without inviting speculation. Beatriz's own social circle clustered around her like a shield. Julia stayed with her for nights, bringing microwave dinners and lending her shoulders for tears.
Beatriz cooked for 3 nights straight without tasting the food, as if the motion of stirring was a mechanism to keep her hands occupied. She rode a wave of fatigue and grief that did not have the noble arcs she had imagined. The humiliation was not theatrical, it was a slow erosion of the private self, a recurring ache that returned when the glasses clinked and the city lights blurred into a screen. When the first wire services sent an inquiry about whether the ceremony was legally binding, Rodrigo called for a meeting. He spoke calmly, laying out options like chess moves. They could seek an annulment, but that required alleging facts that would subject both of them to an invasive inquiry. They could file for divorce, which was quicker and minimized exposure. He acknowledged the moral ambiguity of what they'd just done, presenting themselves as a couple in public. He did not ask her to conceal anything. He asked for honest conversation and for rules that respected the boundaries they'd set in the lawyer's office. "And you understand the implication?" Beatriz asked. "If we divorce in 6 months, people will say we were staging it. They'll say we planned the spectacle." "Let them," Rodrigo said. His voice held no triumph. It was a recognition of the price of optics. "But if you prefer, we can plan the messaging now. We can make our steps sound less sensational and more unfortunate. We can say the truth in a way nobody wants to hear, because the truth is messy." There was a small, fierce thing that flickered in her chest. The idea of ceding the narrative to anyone made her nauseous. She wanted, suddenly, for the story to be told with her voice. She wanted to be the author of whatever came next, and not a footnote in someone else's profile. "Then we control the message by being honest," she said. "No staged philanthropy, no interviews. Let the record be the record. We'll do this properly." He studied her for a long breath, then nodded. "Properly," he repeated. There were, inevitably, awkward moments. At a staff meeting a week later, a junior analyst made a clumsy joke about relationships in the workplace and the way power dynamics could shift. The room froze. Beatriz traced the rim of her coffee cup and felt her features harden in a way that made her appear less human. Rodrigo redirected the meeting gracefully, turning attention to spreadsheets as if romance were a minor error to be corrected in the ledger. Later, in the elevator, he said, "If anyone crosses a line, publicly or privately, document it. HR will act." It was a practical solution to an abstract fear. She appreciated it and resented it in the same breath. Each of his practicalities became a barrier and bridge, protective measures that also kept them out of genuine intimacy. She felt, in the middle of the office hum, a peculiar loneliness that had nothing to do with public attention and everything to do with how complicated the simplest human interactions had become. At night, alone in her apartment, after the city had given in to quiet, Beatriz often replayed the message in her head. "Sorry, I can't." The words were a punctuation that had changed the tenor of months. In the silence that followed, Rodrigo's interventions bobbed like lighthouses around the edges of her life. She did not yet know whether to be grateful for the light or suspicious of the ownership that came with it. For his part, Rodrigo returned to the rhythms of his life with a new notch of involvement. He delegated more at work and maintained a discreet but steady presence in the parts of her world where exposure would be dangerous. He asked once if he could walk her home after a late meeting, and when she said no, he accepted it without pressing. There was a patience in him that concerned rather than charmed her, a kind of strategic patience that could be delicious or dangerous depending on the ending. The first major public test came with the company's charity gala, an event that drew donors and attention in equal measure. The invitation handed to Beatriz had a small notation. "In light of recent events, joint attendance requested." She read the line and felt like a pawn in a courtesy game meant to prove nothing but the continuation of normalcy. They arrived together, as agreed, and their entrance was a study in control. Rodrigo placed Beatriz at his side as if instinctively privatizing her presence. Cameras found them and offered kindled frames for the journalists to stitch into narratives. The evening passed in a blur of speeches and handshakes, and yet in the course of the night Rodrigo sat close enough during a speech that his shoulder brushed against hers. It was a weight that was both protective and proprietary. For a fleeting half-hour, as they listened to the speeches about philanthropy and progress, she forgot to be embarrassed and only felt the comfort of another human presence. After the gala, they drove back in separate cars as they had agreed for the sake of appearances, another boundary kept. When she reached her front door, Rodrigo's car had already disappeared into the city. She turned the key and let herself into the small apartment she'd chosen for its quiet and its proximity to work. There, in the hush of late hours, she breathed out and allowed herself the truth she had been avoiding. The gratitude she felt was not uncomplicated, and neither was the unease. She was not yet in love, she was not sure she would ever be, but she was not indifferent either. A week later, they sat in the lawyer's office together, the room bright with ordinary light, as a thin pile of documents was placed between them. The sheeted papers laid out terms in precise, unromantic language: agreement to pursue a consensual divorce unless both parties opted out within 6 months, confidentiality clauses, mutual non-disparagement, and a clause specifying that any conflicts of interest at work would be addressed through formal reassignments rather than public statements. "Sign here," the lawyer said, tapping a line that shimmered with forms and signatures. The paper asked them to agree not just to the divorce, but to a mutual management of the consequences. Beatriz had expected to feel liberated by the act of signing, to feel the rubber band snap and a release. Instead, signing felt like acknowledging the profundity of their proximity, that a public illusion had turned into a legal fact requiring their signatures to untangle. She hesitated. Rodrigo placed his pen lightly on the table and watched her with a softness she had not seen in him publicly. "If you need more time, say so. There's no rush." The lawyer glanced between them, expecting procedural silence. Beatriz let the pen trail across the dotted line. The motion was small, deliberate. She did not look at Rodrigo's hand as he signed. The act made them both complicit in an arrangement that would be dissected by others. It also made their fates, however temporarily, intersect. They left the office with copies of the agreement and a shared burden to carry. Outside, the city hummed on. It would take more than a few signatures to make sense of everything that had happened. That night, alone in her kitchen with a kettle that whistled but did not soothe, Beatriz considered the shape of the next months. 6 months could be a corridor of healing or a runway of pretense. She did not yet know which. She knew only that she had stepped into a story she had not written, and that the man who had whispered at the altar, whose voice had been equal parts command and concession, was now an unavoidable co-author. There were several ways this could end. She imagined them as doors. One led to a quiet severing, a divorce filed and life continued in parallel tracks. Another led to the slow unspooling of a real companionship, stitched together by small acts of kindness and shared boundaries. A third, darker one, threatened to expose everything to the hungry cameras and strip both of them raw before public sympathy could waver. Before she went to bed, she checked her feed with hands that trembled. Comments spun, and then quieted into a few messages that meant the most. Julia's instant message that read simply, "You are not alone." Her father's call that had been soft and steady. Rodrigo's brief text, "I'll be in touch with the firm tomorrow." It was professional. It was not personal. Still, the knowledge that he had not retreated made something in her chest unclench. She slid under the covers and let the city noises wash over her. There was a distance between the life she had planned and the one she was living now, but even in the bristling uncertainty, a tiny persistent thing began to form, the recognition that being rescued was not the same as being owned. The difference would matter as they navigated the practicalities of courtrooms, headlines, and office politics. Outside, rain started to fall in even, patient threads, a sound that seemed to promise a slow, inevitable cleansing. The phone in her hand was a small, insistent sphere of light. She shut it off and placed it on the nightstand. Tomorrow she would go back to work. Tomorrow Rodrigo would be his precise self, and the lawyers would remind them of clauses. Tomorrow they would have to continue performing toward one another with an honesty that was as wary as it was necessary. For now, in the dark, she allowed herself to imagine simpler things: a kitchen conversation that was not a negotiation, a coffee shared without cameras, a meal cooked together and left cooling on the counter.
They were small, potentially insignificant images, but they kept her from being swallowed by the enormity of what had unfolded. And sometimes, she thought, small things were the only honest path back into the possibility of any life after a public humiliation. When she finally slept, it was with the city breathing against the windows and the certainty that everything had changed. The ceremony had been an improvisation born of urgency. The papers they had signed in the lawyer's office were an attempt at control. But between the urgency and the control, there was a stretch of days, an uncertain, open distance where two people who had never chosen each other under ordinary conditions might find reasons to be close that were neither coerced nor calculated. She did not know yet whether she could trust that possibility. She only knew the feeling of the bouquet in her hand, the echo of a three-word message, and the whisper that had cut into the center of the storm: "Pretend I'm the groom." If you want more stories like this, hit like and subscribe. The agreement defined boundaries, but it could not predict the small combustions of desire or the awkward kindnesses that thread two people together. Over the next few days, they maneuvered their way through the expected. Interviews politely declined, calendars rearranged, a joint statement posted that thanked friends and asked for privacy. The statement was careful, smooth, and no one was satisfied, including Beatriz. Honesty was too messy for social media. A week after the signing, the company announced a temporary redistribution of responsibilities so that no direct reporting lines existed between them. Rodrigo publicly endorsed the measure as a commitment to transparency. Private conversations followed. In one of them, he surprised her by telling her something he had not said in the church or in the lawyer's office, a sentence that was simple and unnerving because of its rarity. "I don't do this for people," he said, as if clarifying an exception. "But I did it because I couldn't stand the idea of you being humiliated." It was a sentence with edges, care and distance, a guarded admission of motive. Beatriz looked at him and for a second glimpsed behind the impassive mask a man who had weighed the public costs and chosen to act anyway. It did not erase the politics of the rescue or the fact that his position made what he offered complicated, but it offered another truth, that his decision was, in its way, human. They both agreed, later and more freely, to limit personal contact. The clause became their lifeline: professional interactions, check-ins via email where necessary, personal space honored. It was a form of consent by design, meant to safeguard against the narrative of coercion. And yet, human intimacy is not a ledger. It moves in gradients, sometimes slipping the bounds of the neat agreements they had inked.
On an ordinary Tuesday, as winter crept into the city and made the air thin and honest, Rodrigo left a small wrapped box on Beatriz's desk. Inside, an elegant notepad and a fountain pen sat like an absurd promise of ordinary life. Attached was a thin strip of paper with a single phrase: "For when your life gets messy and you need a clean sheet." She turned the ribbon between her fingers and felt something soft and private. It was a courtesy. It was, she told herself, nothing more than a recognition that he saw her as human in the middle of a public farce. She wrote back a short, careful note of thanks. The exchange was small, and it kept both of them within the boundaries they had drawn, while adding minute gestures of attention that neither could incorporate into the legal document they had signed. The months ahead promised to test the line between kindness and entanglement. The papers were signed, the city hummed, people would talk, but there remained in the quiet acts the umbrella in the rain, the pills for a fever, the notepad on a desk, a scaffolding that could either build a real relationship or simply prop up a more elaborate performance.
They kept walking toward whatever came next, both of them aware that the world watched and that privacy was a currency that had to be spent wisely. In the middle of their day-to-day, the thing that had happened at the altar refused to shrink. The whisper that had changed everything, "Pretend I'm the groom," echoed like an invitation and a challenge, a phrase whose meaning would deepen in ways neither of them yet understood. Days accumulated like quiet fillings between louder moments. The city moved around them, traffic reports, an unremarkable breakfast, the ritual of suit jackets draped over chairs, while the accidental marriage sat between them as both an explanation and an irritation. Beatriz learned to measure time in the small confirmations of life, the way Rodrigo's hand hovered at the doorknob before he pushed it open for her at the office, the way he answered an email with uncanny speed when a client threatened to pull funding. She catalogued these actions not as declarations, but as data points, evidence that the arrangement had weight beyond the camera lenses that had once punctured her privacy. Work, for both of them, became a map of careful coordination. Rodrigo made it clear he would not be her direct supervisor. Projects were reassigned, her role adjusted to remove any hint of favoritism. He did not delegate quietly. He changed organizational charts, placed oversight on paper that could be read and photocopied. It was practical, public, and antiseptic. He wanted everyone to know that he would not manipulate lines for the sake of an image. He wanted, too, to protect himself from accusations that might one day translate into legal problems. For Beatriz, the rules mattered. She insisted upon them because dignity, after such exposure, felt like the only currency she could spend with clarity.
They respected the rules for many days. Their conversations were professional, brief, and deliberate. The novelty of being in the same office as the man who had rescued her faded into a different type of discomfort, one that came from learning each other's rhythms in fluorescent light rather than in candlelit rooms. But private moments leaked through. Privacy did not hold forever against familiarity. Small kindnesses multiplied to the point where she almost mistook them for a pattern. One Wednesday, a crisis arrived, like a test. A major client had discovered a discrepancy in production forecasts. A shipment would be delayed, costing millions if not managed overnight. The board demanded answers. The company's PR team braced for headlines. Rodrigo walked into the war room with the same composed aggression that had steered him through other storms. He pulled a chair beside Beatriz, tapped a spreadsheet, and asked, without pretense, for her assessment. "You're right," she said after an hour of numbers and tense phone calls. "If we move the secondary supplier up by 2 weeks and reallocate freight, we lose margin but save lead time. It won't please finance, but it will stop reputational damage." He did not challenge her. He used her strategy. In the next meeting, he presented the reroute as a tactical decision informed by logistics insight, credit where it was due. Afterward, in the elevator, his voice found an edge she had not heard before. "You were decisive," he said. "You didn't flinch." She wanted to laugh at the observation. She wanted to tell him that flinching had been her default state for months. Instead, she said, "You saw it because you asked. That's not exactly a compliment." He said, "It is to me. I like competence. I like it more when it's not performative." There was no romance in the exchange, only recognition, and that small acknowledgement landed with a warmth that was not theatrical, but human. Moments like that multiplied, a hand on her elbow in the hallway to steer her away from a camera, a text in the early hours telling her a reporter had phoned and advising caution. Each move was modest and precise. None of them bore the splash of melodrama that might have made their lives headlines for another reason. Once, late into a stretch of overtime, Rodrigo offered to buy dinner from the corner place because the cafeteria had closed. They ate in the conference room under the hum of monitors, boxed food between them. The conversation slid from spreadsheets to small, less guarded things, a television show one of them found ridiculous, the little annoyances of urban living. He told her, almost by accident, a detail he rarely shared, that as a child he had watched his mother negotiate with shopkeepers for fresh fruit, learning early that a story could be steered by tone and firmness. "It's not a sentimental lesson," he said, stirring noodles with a plastic fork. "It's a practical one."
You ask for what you need, and you do it without theatrics. She looked at him and saw the man who had chosen a specific texture of intervention at the altar, practical, antiseptic, minimally performative, and understood for the first time that his decisions were not born of impulse, but of training, habit, a philosophy of action. That day he left a napkin with her name on it folded under his empty container. It was ridiculous and tender at once. Publicly, the world kept honing stories. A columnist speculated on the romantic calculus behind the rescue. An influencer posted a side-by-side of the altar photograph and Rodrigo at his desk, and the comment section became a contest of speculation. Beatriz had grown used to scanning headlines, like someone checking weather before a planned outing. They told her where to expect public gusts. Julia told her to let the commentary burn off, but Beatriz noticed that comments sometimes bled into the office, a passing smirk, the odd pause in the lunchroom. Those looks were the residue of other people's narratives. The only narratives that mattered were the ones the two of them would choose to inhabit. Then Raphael returned. He did not appear theatrically at the office door. He arrived like an old headline, uncomfortable but familiar. They ran into each other at a charity event one Sunday, the kind of gathering where wine and small talk smoothed edges and made people forget the specificity of pain. He approached as if he were apologizing for a misstep more than a betrayal, as if his disappearance had been an inconvenience rather than a wound. "Beatriz," he said, as if the name tasted like relief. "I messed up." Her cheeks warmed at the sight of him. It had been months. She had crafted a life that kept his absence folded neatly away. He looked thinner, as if the carefree preservation of this or that had been stripped from him. He had a letter in his hand, whatever that meant, and when he spoke, his voice carried the practiced cadence of remorse learned in late-night monologues. "People said things, and I let them. They made me doubt what I wanted," he said. "I panicked. I shouldn't have run." Anger climbed first, a hot, protective heat that felt like a shield. He had left her at the worst possible moment, sent 3 words that detonated their plans, and expected to be welcomed back into the orbit of forgiveness because time had passed. But beneath anger there was a more complicated thread. Grief, the stub of hope she'd carried, the long rehearsal of what normal might be. "Why now?" she asked. Her voice was even. She had learned how to make her tone the guardrail for her body. He hesitated. "I saw what happened. I saw that it wasn't a private thing anymore. I was wrong. I want to fix it, if you'll let me. I want to try again." The offer came with the expectation of acceptance, a natural assumption that anyone would rejoin a comfortable script.
Their conversation opened with the small formalities of collaboration, the processes they'd been taught, but the tone quickly narrowed into the narrow corridor where two people's private futures are negotiated. "We can file," Rodrigo said, folding his hands. "We can sign and proceed in a way that is clean and removes any appearance of impropriety." "Or we can wait," she said. "We agreed to 6 months. The papers arrived early." "They arrived because we authorized them," he answered. "I spoke with Raphael's—" "Don't," she interjected. "This isn't about him." He blinked and then nodded. His face was unreadable for a moment, the mask of the corporate leader settling into place and then softening like something of his own backstory shifting under pressure. "I don't want to rush you," he said, "but if you want a professional ending—" "I don't know what I want," she confessed, which was both frightening and honest. "I don't want to be rescued and then feel obligated. I am wary of being grateful, as if that should require me to relinquish anything." He listened. His eyes were not clinical now. They were attentive in a way that asked for more than a rehearsed answer. "Then don't," he said in a voice that was unperformative and oddly intimate. "We don't have to sign anything today." They left the cafe without making irreversible moves, but the presence of the papers created an undercurrent, an awareness of what might be lost if either acted without regard for the other's agency. Legal maneuvers followed, a careful call to the attorney, a consultation on the mechanics of withdrawing documents and the implications of both staying married and letting a divorce proceed. The lawyer's voice, when they sat across his polished desk, was calm and procedural. "If neither party files, and no petition has been filed with the court, there is no formal dissolution. You two are still legally married. If you both decide to stop pursuing divorce, you simply don't prosecute the case. However, you must be mindful of optics at work. If you remain married and are visible as a couple, it will raise issues. If you reconcile, the company must adjust reporting structures. If you do not, it may be advisable to file the divorce to close the issue." Beatriz listened and felt the logic of the box. Every decision required trade-offs. She had found dignity in stipulating boundaries at work. She wanted to keep that dignity, even if her personal feelings shifted. She wanted to choose freely, not be maneuvered by public pressure or by the weight of a signed line. While lawyers outlined options in clipped syllables, the private thing between her and Rodrigo continued to change in small, inarticulate ways. It wasn't a sudden bloom, it was a softening of the edges as they saw one another in contexts away from performative rescue. He invited her to a small staff lunch as a matter of practical exposure. She accepted because it was mundane. He listened when she spoke about her mother and her failed attempts to learn her grandmother's recipes. She watched the way he grew quiet when someone made a joke at his expense and felt a strange protective sympathy. One night, after a long week and a longer client dinner, they found themselves alone in Rodrigo's kitchen, an apartment that had always seemed to Beatriz like a cathedral to minimalism. Hard surfaces, carefully chosen objects, a view that disdained ornament. Rodrigo had nearly finished a simple pasta. There was a pan, a cutting board, a bottle of wine half opened. He moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who found comfort in precision. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a stool as he stirred sauce. "I burned dinner a lot as a child. My dad wasn't around. My mother taught me how to cook because she said a man who could not feed himself could not be trusted at work." Beatriz laughed, a real sound that loosened something in the air. "That's not true," she said. "We have many great men who are lousy at cooking." "Maybe they compensate elsewhere," he shrugged, but the smile that followed made his whole face shift. They ate at the counter, forks pausing to make room for speech. The conversation bent toward the hypothetical, small things, like whether a life should be planned or left to chance. He told her, quietly, without drama, that he had spent the better part of his adulthood compartmentalizing intimacy because he believed things could be ruined by too much transparency. He had been taught that showing vulnerability invited leverage. He had learned to be self-sufficient as a defense. "I used to think independence kept me safe," he said, "but safety is not the same as solitude." The admission came with an apology for being slow to care and for his tendency to measure people by outcomes rather than by their hearts. It was not contrition for the altar rescue. He did not couch his action in theatrical moralizing, but it was a softening of the armor that allowed her to see a man who could be lonely beneath the surface. She told him then about the small fear that had crawled up her spine the night Raphael sent the message, that she might be too ready to accept rescue if it arrived packaged in decisiveness. She spoke about dignity, about the need to choose for herself. The conversation moved deliberately toward the word choice, and then toward consent, how consent was not a single moment, but a practice repeated across days. He listened without interruption. When she finished, he reached out and laid his hand over hers on the counter. It was a simple gesture that was not possessive. It was steadying, a kind of human calibration. She did not pull away. Over the following weeks, touch became an unremarkable thing. A hand brushed her back in a crowded hallway to steer her past a camera. A shoulder touched her during a meeting and lingered long enough to count as an apology for something neither could name.
Each contact was negotiated, unassuming, and explicitly consensual. Any moment that might have felt coercive carried instead with it the vocabulary of permission. They asked each other quietly before moving closer. The thesis of their proximity, what had begun as a rescue, did not dissolve into the ideal romance immediately. There were awkward halts, moments when their pre-existing rules reasserted themselves, and days when a headline would reawaken her skin to prickles of dread. But between those moments, the intimacy that thrived was one of small mercies, sharing an umbrella, splitting a sandwich during a marathon board meeting, sending a message that offered a neutral observation at the end of a draining day. Then the papers were delivered in a different way, not a bland envelope this time, but a thicker packet, stamped and official, documents that required signatures to initiate formal proceedings. A courier left them at her desk, and a junior associate, blinking with the awareness of bearing cargo of consequence, placed them gently on the stack of her files. It was the moment that had been both promised and dreaded. They had prepared for this as if it were inevitable, but inevitability never fully prepares you for the gravity of ink and claws. The papers named terms for settlement and custody of certain shared belongings, a remarkably small inventory, a set of china from her grandmother, a silver cufflink she had once bought Raphael as a joke. They contained technical language indicating the convenience of a tidy conclusion. They bore lines for signatures. Rodrigo stood behind her as she read, his presence a quiet force. There was a tension in him that she recognized. He had never liked matters unresolved. The two of them had made a pact of patience, but the arrival of the documents pressed on that patience like a finger on a wound. "Do you want to sign today?" he asked. She looked at him. His eyes had a clarity that made her nervous. He was asking not as a man of authority, but as someone whose life had been carved into similar decisions and who understood the cost. "I don't know," she said. "I don't think this answers anything that matters." He reached for the folder and did something unexpected. He slid it back across the desk and closed it. "Then we don't," he said simply. "Not today." When they left the office that evening, it was raining in a steady, cleansing sweep. They walked beneath umbrellas, shoulders nearly touching, and it felt as natural as rain falling. They had made a decision, small in legal terms, large in emotional reality, to refuse to make an irreversible choice simply because a bureaucratic instrument demanded it. They would not sign away what they had not yet had a chance to understand. The public, as it always does, demanded a narrative. A gossip site leaked a rumor that their relationship had solidified into something else, and the rumor metastasized into commentary.
Investors called. Competitors parsed the implications. Rodrigo took the calls with his habitual calm. Then, in a move that broke the usual reticence of his silence, he spoke in a company-wide meeting. "People will invent stories about us," he said into the microphone, his voice audible in a room that smelled faintly of coffee and ambition. "We don't need their permission to decide what we want. There will be no preferential assignments. Miss Almeida will continue in her role with the same expectations as anyone else. If anyone has concerns about conflict of interest, bring them to HR. There will be transparent procedures in place." His language was administrative, but the statement carried a human weight. It declared a presumption that whatever happened between them would be treated as a matter of mutual agency, not of spectacle. The move diffused some gossip and inflamed other speculation, but it set a legal and cultural frame that recognized Beatriz's autonomy. In private, Rodrigo continued to show his care in ways that were both practical and personal. He asked her about her mother's health, about old recipes she had tried and failed to master, about the books she read on sleepless nights. He listened, and sometimes, unexpectedly, laughed. During a hospital visit when her father had a minor procedure, he sat in the waiting room and offered no commentary, simply a presence that did not demand explanation. She had always been cautious of grand gestures. His were small, consistent, and never to be used as leverage. For Beatriz, that consistency mattered as much as any speech. She began, almost without noticing, to anticipate his words. She began to include him in the private calculus of her choices. The prospect of living a life where he was not present sometimes struck her as a loss rather than a relief. The idea frightened her because it implied that she had already started to care. The process of caring is often messy because it requires risk. One evening after a long day, Rodrigo showed up at her door with a packet of takeout and a movie under his arm. "No cameras," he said. "No interviews. Just, if you want company." She opened the door and let him in. In her small kitchen, under a lamp that softened the room, they ate and watched a film that was forgettable. They traded stories about childhood mistakes and teenage embarrassments. Rodrigo volunteered, between bites, a confession. "I thought that if I never let anyone close enough to hurt me, I'd be safe. But safety is not the same as living. I don't want to be safe if it means hollow." His hand found hers across the low table. The touch was light but deliberate. She squeezed back, answering with a gesture that had neither calculation nor bravado. They talked until the city outside fell quiet, and their words softened into the ease of two people learning the geography of each other.
When the divorce papers returned to the table shortly after, this time by formal service, they were no longer just a file to be filled. They were a fork in the road. Beatriz sat alone in her living room with the stack balanced on her knees. The lamp cast a warm circle over the legalese that felt suddenly foreign. She called Rodrigo. He came immediately. They met at her kitchen table. The mood was domestic and therefore intimate, a dangerous combination. For months they had practiced consent like an instrument. They had asked permission before touching, had implemented boundaries at work, and negotiated small, meaningful rules in private. Now the papers asked for signatures to formalize a division they had not yet emotionally reached. "I don't want to sign because I think I have to," she said. "I don't want to file because I'm afraid of regret." "I don't want you to sign because of pressure," he replied. "And I don't want to file so that something we might have," his voice dropped, "is lost because of bureaucracy." Beatrice looked at him. The honesty in both their faces had grown teeth, real, necessary things that could hurt if used poorly, but could also cut away false assumptions. "What are we to each other?" she asked. "Because I know what I don't want, but I don't know what I do." He took a breath and answered in a way that contained both his caution and his longing. "I don't know fully, but I know this. I don't want you to feel owned. I don't want my position to make you vulnerable in the wrong way. But I also don't want to throw away the chance at something honest because we were afraid of the optics." There was a silence after that. It was not emptiness. It was the kind that held things in suspension, like a held breath before a plunge. Beatrice imagined for a moment what it would mean to step into a marriage by choice rather than by accident. She thought of the power dynamics and the safeguards they had enacted. She thought of the lows she had floundered through and the small mercies that had kept her afloat. "Then let's do it differently," she said slowly. "Let's not sign the papers today. Let's speak with counsel. Outline boundaries, restructure at work so nothing can be misconstrued, and then, if both of us choose, decide to stay together because we want to, not because we were trapped." He exhaled like someone relieved. "Yes," he said. "Yes, let's do it because we choose it. Let's make the choice conscious." They called the lawyer, arranged a meeting, and together proposed a plan. No filing for divorce, leave the matter open with explicit documentation that neither party wished to prosecute the case, submission of a written agreement to the company to reassign any potential conflicts of interest, a binding commitment to consult with independent counsel should either wish to pursue a change.
The lawyer listened, scribbled notes, and then typed into formal language the parameters that would protect both of them legally and ethically. In the end, they did not sign away their proximity with the ink of resignation. They paused the process and instead set conditions. They would live within rules and still be allowed to feel. The world continued to speak. Some outlets called it a PR stunt, others a love story in the making. Beatriz ignored both extremes. She focused on the work of living with someone who had both power and restraint. Rodrigo surprised her one Sunday morning by suggesting they redo the wedding, this time privately, with only a handful of friends, properly planned and chosen by them. It was not the ostentatious redo some imagined. It was a small decision born of his desire to do right. He wanted their first intentional moment together to be theirs. "Nothing public unless you want it," he said. "No charity galas, no cameras. We do it the way you want, if you want." She looked at him. The invitation was genuine and terrifying in a different way. To agree would mean to risk vulnerability again on purpose. "There's a catch," she said. He blinked. "There always is." "I want a real partnership at work," she said, surprising herself with the frankness of the request. "Not because I want power, because I want autonomy and recognition. If we're choosing each other, then my life should not be at the mercy of rumor. I want the offer in writing, a clear role, responsibilities, and an equity stake that makes me a partner in this, not an appointee." He considered the demand with a gravity that made it clear this was precisely the language he respected: concrete, firm, non-negotiable. "I'll offer you a formal role," he said. "I'll propose a restructure, an equity stake. I will make sure it's clear to our board that you are not in my chain of command." She almost asked him to say it aloud in front of the board. Instead, she said, "Make it happen." He did. Weeks later, the memorandum arrived, a promotion not to a cosmetic title, but a real offer of partnership, a stake and a seat at a table she'd long admired from afar. The announcement was careful, worded to emphasize professional merits and transparency. Some shareholders cheered, others raised skeptical eyebrows, but the document was real, and when Beatriz read it, she felt her chest loosen with the gravity of possibility. The offer meant that if she chose to stay, she would not be subsumed into an identity defined by the rescue. She would be an equal participant in their shared landscape. She accepted the offer because it made sense to her head, and because part of her heart, small and cautious, began to suspect that the man who had saved her at the altar might, in the long run, be someone who would stand beside her rather than above her. The company instituted recusal processes and a public statement reaffirming their commitment to ethical governance.
It was, in every sense, an adult solution to a messy problem. Raphael, observing the changes, made one last attempt to reinsert himself into the arc. He called repeatedly, sent messages that alternated between apologies and pleas. Beatriz read them, and then, after a week of consideration, called him back. They met in a neutral cafe. She told him, with a kindness that was also firm, that she understood his remorse, but that their chapter had closed. "You left," she said. "I don't want to be someone you come to when it's convenient to feel regret. You need to live with your choices." He left the meeting in silence, and this time his absence felt like an end rather than an open wound. The closure landed with the quietness of finality. At last, with legal issues addressed and the company structure arranged, Rodrigo asked for one more private conversation. They met in the quiet of a small art gallery that Rodrigo favored,
a place with white walls and a softness of echo. It was an environment removed from the practicalities that had dominated recent months, and it allowed them to speak without whiteboards and agendas. "I don't want this to be performative," he said, turning to her. "I want it to be chosen. I want you to know that if you ever feel coerced, you can leave. I will not stop you. But if you want to stay, if you want to commit, I'd rather have you choose me because you wanted to share a life, not because of what the cameras made us." She looked at him. The man who'd whispered, "Pretend I'm the groom," in the cathedral had, in the months since, revealed layers she had not expected to find. There was a softness in his eyes that had not been there in the early days. He was not less guarded. He simply had chosen to be visible in a way that did not try to own her. She said, "Then ask me properly. If you want this, ask me like you mean it." He laughed softly at her directness. Then, with an earnestness that was almost reverent, he took both her hands in his. The gallery's white light softened the edges of their faces. He bent his right knee in an old gesture that, to both, felt ridiculous and ancient at the same time. He did not reach for grand pronouncements. He spoke with a stripped-down clarity. "Beatriz Almeida," he said, "I have not been simple or conventional. I have been a man who chooses practicality over poetry. But I am asking, now, if you will marry me. If you will marry me not out of necessity, but because you want to. If you want to be my partner in life, in business, in everything we choose to share. Will you marry me for real?" The room was small, their circle of consequence intimate. The question was enormous for the simplicity with which it was delivered. Beatriz thought of the bouquet, the priest's practiced smile, the 3 words that had started this cascade. She thought of their tedious allowed meetings with lawyers, the late dinners, the slogan of boundaries. She also thought about the small kindnesses that had built across months, sharing umbrellas, the notepad, the flattened napkin he once left in the conference room. She thought of the promotion and the written commitment that proved his respect for her agency. She considered power, gratitude, and the fact that rescue without reciprocity can become its own prison. She considered the price of choosing to stay and the price of leaving. She took his hands and then answered not with a performative yes, but with a careful, deliberate affirmation. "Yes," she said, "yes, because I choose you, because I want to." They did not invite cameras. They did not ask for a marquee. They invited only their closest friends, Julia, her father, and 2 colleagues who had been quietly supportive. One, an HR director who had helped construct the company's safeguards, the other, a mentor who had always spoken plainly about merit. They stood in a small room with a soft light, the sound of distant traffic, and a few candles. The priest who had officiated the original chaotic ceremony offered a pared-back blessing that felt like a benediction rather than theatre. They exchanged vows that were not long, but they were deliberate. Beatriz spoke of dignity, of choosing herself, and of the strange alchemy that had turned humiliation into agency. Rodrigo spoke of humility, of learning the dangerous tenderness of letting someone in, and of the promise to respect boundaries. They sealed the vow privately, with a ring that had been chosen together in a quiet jewelry shop, not for price, but for personal meaning. A simple band set with a tiny, imperfect etching, to mark a history and their willingness to shape the future. Afterwards there were calls and a modest statement to the press that emphasized privacy, partnership, and a mutual decision. The company issued the press release about her promotion and the governance changes with a tone of professional clarity. The world, predictably, had a spectrum of interpretations, from cynicism to a gratifyingly human reading of 2 people making a difficult choice in plain sight. Whatever the commentators said, the 2 of them had decided the truth for themselves. At work, the dynamic shifted in a way that felt both natural and engineered. Rodrigo remained at the helm of the company, but he had taken steps to recuse himself from projects that directly involved her. Beatriz took her new role seriously, earning respect not by the story that preceded her, but by decisions that reflected intelligence and courage.
Investors found competence where they had expected scandal. Colleagues found in her the person who could hold her own under pressure. She gained not only a title, but the ability to seat herself at the table and speak with authority. Years later, when some asked how she could have accepted the aisle whisper that had started it all, she would tell them that the whisper was not the story's moral center.
The story's center, she would say, was the choice to make life from the ruin rather than to sink. That choice had required legal counsel, negotiations, and a steadfast insistence on agency. It had required patience and the insistence that consent is not a single act, but a repeated practice. It had required a man who could be both powerful and willing to be guided by rules that protected the one he loved. Raphael moved away shortly after, taking a job in another city. He called once with a sincere apology, and then receded into the soft gray of what-ifs. Julia married a year later and asked Beatriz to stand beside her as a friend who had learned to hold her own. The company prospered under a leadership style that balanced ambition with a clearer awareness of human cost. Rodrigo, in public, remained the precise, calm man who avoided flashy headlines. In private, he became someone who would leave the office lights on in the early hours to talk through a tough decision, or to share a tea while the city slept. Some mornings, Beatriz would awake to the small, ordinary things that had once been her dreams: a coffee left on the counter, a note with a grocery list, the soft commotion of plates in the sink. Once, when she was washing a pan, she found him behind her, and he leaned in to press a kiss to her temple. It was not cinematic, it was small and true. She squeezed his hand without thinking about headlines. It felt, finally, ordinary. They had begun as a rescue, an act performed under pressure, and they had layered that beginning with consent, negotiation, and work that made their togetherness sustainable. They had not allowed themselves to be defined solely by the spectacle. They had chosen one another out of mutual respect rather than out of the obligation of a single dramatic moment. In doing so, they had turned a day of humiliation into the foundation of a life carefully built. For Beatriz, the most potent truth was simple. She had been left at the altar, abandoned and shamed, and then named by a man who demanded she pretend to be someone else's bride. But she had refused to let that moment take the authorship of her life. She had reclaimed it by insisting upon boundaries, by refusing to be rushed by legal forms, and by demanding a partnership that recognized her autonomy. In the end, what had started with 3 small words and a whisper became, by deliberate choice, something that belonged wholly to the 2 people who had built it. Tell us in the comments, would you accept a rescue like Rodrigo's, knowing the complications? Share and subscribe.